Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Just Do You podcast. My name is Eric Nicole, and I'm your host. If you are a first time listener, welcome to the conversation. And if you're a regular, I'm honored that you've decided to join me for another episode. The Just Do You podcast is centered around a network of conversations which are meant to connect us, to inspire us, to find our own confidence, our own voice, and to live our own truth. And who knows, we might even learn a little something new that ultimately allows us to live in the sweet spot that I like to call the Just Do You space of being. Each week, I have the privilege of sitting down for unscripted conversations with friends, family, colleagues, community leaders, and influencers that all share their own personal journeys. I hope that you enjoy our time together as much as I have. We are certainly going to laugh, and yes, we might even cry a little. But in the end, we're going to know that we're not alone during our life's journey. So, are you ready? Great, let's do this. Welcome to the conversation. All right, everyone, welcome to today's episode. We are into season 2, Fast and Furious, and I could think of no better person to have jump on today than my guest, Steve Yacovelli. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad that you're here. And this has been a long time coming. We've been talking about this for a couple months. And so I'm really excited to sit down and chat with you today, have our listeners get to know you a little bit better. I could not think of a better time. As we know, so much happening within the LGBTQ community and the gender conversation. And what is so great about our conversation today is I hope it leaves people with a little glimmer of hope of who they are as a human being is valued, and we are seeing you and we are acknowledging you and we are hearing you. So I'm going to take a second just to introduce you a little bit and then we'll get started. Okay.
Great.
Cool. So for our guest, Steve is otherwise known as the Gay Leadership Dude, which I love that name. I think it's awesome. And also part of Top Dog Learning Group, which we're going to talk about. Steve is an award-winning best-selling author. He's a keynote speaker, and he's helping people become consciously inclusive and how to be better leaders. And I really like this. In your bio, it said that you realized that there was no focus on specifically developing LGBTQ leadership within the corporate spectrum, right? I want to talk about why that is. Before we go there, take us back a little bit. I want to know about the young Steve. Where were you born? Where'd you grow up? Only child? When did you come out? Give us a little bit of that history.
So I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. So a child of the 80s ish, and youngest of three. Parents are still together, still around. I'm very blessed in that way, but had a pretty chill, middle class childhood in the burbs. Did not know my authentic self at the time. That 80s, early 90s kind of thing. That's not uncommon. I went to undergrad at a state school in Pennsylvania, and then my dream was to work for Disney. And so like everybody around me knew it. All my fraternity brothers knew it, all that stuff. And so after undergrad, not long after, I just packed out my little car and drove to Orlando, Florida. And I just got a job as an hourly employee at Disney, and it was horrible. And I love Disney. That story actually ends better, but it was just a really not a good time for Steve. And so after about 3 months, I almost got into a near fatal car accident. And the same week that my apartment had been robbed, the same week that my apartment had been flooded. So I'm like, if you believe in God, universe, Buddha, insert bigger thing here, I'm like, wow, that's 3 strikes in 1 week. I think I'm out of here. So I moved back up to Philly in with Mom and Paul. And that's when I figured out, oh, I think I like boys. This is really not good timing, because now I'm living with my parents, never really lied to them as a kid. And now I'm sneaking off to the gay bars in Philly, going to quote unquote, meet some fraternity brothers for a beer and kind of doing that thing.
Right.
And then as irony would have it, about 9 months later, got a job back in Orlando, Florida. So moved back here a second time. And I was kid in the candy store, brand new little young gayling in my 20s, met some of my closest friends to this day, as many of us do with our found family kind of thing. And then moved up quickly to Ohio for a couple years for grad school, just because I wanted to go to grad school. And after 2 years, I looked at DC, Chicago, and I'm like, the weather in Orlando was pretty good. So I moved back down to Orlando for time number 3. So my friends start calling me Boomerang, because they're like, we throw you away, you keep coming back. And I moved on a Monday, and I met my now husband of 27 years on Friday. So there's that.
Well, maybe I'm moving to Orlando.
Go on down.
That's a whole other podcast. Did you say 80s?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
I love
Feeling
the 80s.
super I'm feeling super old right now. Super old, but it's all great. Well, it's interesting because, so many people that I've talked to on this podcast, it's called Just Do You. So it's really centered around finding that authentic self,
Mhm.
living that authentic truth. And not only that, how do you find the confidence? How do you find the posture? How do you find the vocabulary, especially when I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, late 60s and early
Yeah,
70s.
quite a-
And also in 80s, we really didn't have the languaging and we didn't have a lot of exposure to the community. And so what I've been really in awe over are the multitude of stories and the diverse stories within all the members of the LGBTQ, plus community. And so it doesn't matter whether you're from the West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, whatever, we all have that journey. And I think it's interesting that we have seemingly gravitated towards, areas that are pretty LGBTQ friendly, right? Orlando's very friendly.
yeah,
Been
we're a
there
blue
several
bubble.
times, little bubble, and done a lot of events there, and remember going out to some of the clubs there in my 20s as well.
Yeah.
Quite an experience. So Orlando's very lucky to have you.
No,
What was your focus in school again?
so undergrad was speech communications, public relations, and then my master's is in educational policy and leadership, and then my doctorate's in instructional technology and distance education. So I like to say I was Zooming before Zoom was a thing here in this
Wow.
distance world.
Did you know back then that you would slant a little bit more towards the LGBTQI community in your work, or no?
No, not at all. That's a funny thing. I was just talking with somebody earlier today, and he's like, it's so great that you focus here." I said, "I'll be truth be told, I've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion work for 25 plus years, and I started doing that when I worked at internal at Disney, and it's time number two, so that's the good time.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
the first hourly time that I eventually became an internal leadership consultant, and part of that mix was looking at diversity, equity, inclusion. So I started learning that many many years ago in the broader sense of just creating that sense of belonging for anyone, didn't matter the
Mhm.
demographic. And then it wasn't until my last book came out, and for those who are following along, Pride Leadership Strategies for the
Mhm.
LGBTQ plus leader to be the king or queen of the jungle, the one right here if you
Oh,
happen to be
nice.
watching the video. And I was working with my publisher, Jen Grace of Publisher Purpose Press. And so she's also an expert marketer in addition to being a publisher, and lesbian owned, which is even more fun. So we're going down this path, and we getting into the editing process, and she's like, "Hey, I have a question for you from a marketing perspective. What's your brand?" And I said, "Well, my brand, Top Dog Learning Group." She's like, "No, that's your business. What's your personal brand?" I'm
Mm.
like, I don't have one. She's like, "Well, you need one. Most authors should have one." And then that's kind of how the Gay Leadership Dude, Circle R, so I'm the only one who owns it. The Gay Leadership Dude was born. And of course, through writing of that book, Pride Leadership, is really when I started putting the focus on leadership through the rainbow lens, as I like to say, because it was going down the path of a generic leadership book, given I've been doing this stuff for 30 years and you see patterns that work and don't. I'm like, there's a book in my head. And then I started looking around at our brothers and sisters and siblings doing advocacy work on behalf of our queer community. And Eric, you remember Sex in the City?
Mhm.
Raise your one. Okay. So if you remember, if you're listening or watching, you don't remember that. It's not the newest one, it's the older one. Carrie, the protagonist, would sit down on her little MacBook and type in, "I
Mhm.
couldn't help but wonder." And so as I'm watching our queer siblings take these leadership roles to advocate on behalf of our community, I couldn't help but wonder, is there something about the queer experience in generic terms that lends us to look at leadership competencies through the rainbow lens and maybe in a slightly different way? And as I think about what are the important leadership competencies that really make or break a difference, gay or straight, it was these six that I was writing about. But then I started thinking about them through, and for those who aren't watching, it's authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture. And so authenticity, the Brené Brown of the world and other great folks are saying, hey, if you're authentic, you're going to be an effective leader, period. But then when you start thinking about a queer person, like if I'm an out
Mhm.
lesbian, a gay man, a trans person being my authentic self, that's power. And you're practicing that effective leadership competency. So that's kind of where the pivot started happening to really focus on the queer community. And I realized no one really is outside of a couple conferences here and there. So I felt that voice and that microphone were really much needed.
Why do you think it was so limited? What's your take on that?
I don't think it was necessarily on purpose. I just don't think that over at least my professional career, that conversation wasn't happening. And then probably because people weren't even thinking that. I mean, people were starting to
Hmm.
think about like women's leadership, for example, or persons of color and what that does to their leadership awesomeness, and veterans and how they parlay that experience and demographic into effective leadership. But no one was talking this stuff.
Hmm.
When I was doing the preliminary research, I found one book that talked about it. It was called The G Quotient. And it was actually a
Hmm.
study
Hmm.
that was done. It's a great study, Kurt Schneider. But it was also very limited. And I acknowledge actually I even cite him in my book and talk about, it's a great book, but the study in its day was very limited to mostly white gay dudes. And so you weren't really seeing the true spectrum of the queer community. But that was it. That's really anyone does. Now, flash forward, you have books like mine. There's lots of other consultants and authors who do this kind of stuff. There's now executive programs at Stanford and now Harvard. So you're seeing a lot more of it because I think the power of the diverse experience, people know that it does affect your leadership for the better. And how do you parlay that into supporting people in our community to be more
Hmm.
effective leaders?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating in the time that we're in, especially this week that we're recording this podcast. We're watching DE&I just eviscerated,
Yeah.
and the removal of information and history we're seeing just evaporate at the push of a button. And at the same time, our LGBTQIA community is growing stronger and stronger
Yeah.
by the minute. And I've always said that you can take us off a website, but you can't take us off the map, because
No.
once you do that, there's two people you don't piss off. I think the LGBTQ community and women. And so I think it's mostly mothers, but I was like included women now in that conversation.
Yeah.
But I think with the current climate, I think we're going to see a lot more attention brought to this leadership aspect, because
Yeah.
we're going to need it. We can talk about several of the people who were running for office this last go around that are now in office, that are going to be the voices that we need. So that to me is that glimmer of hope that I see, that although it's trying to be erased, it never will be.
Mhm.
And I think now more than ever, with having people like you and people that are out walking the walk, talking the talk, doing the hard work, that people will see that this diversity, equity, and inclusion not only is paramountly important, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one thing that gives me hope. That coupled with the youth, Gen
Yeah.
Z. I mean, there's some fantastic studies that are out there talking about. EY just published, I think it was last year, or yeah, well, last year, not
Mhm.
2024, and they were
Yeah.
looking at Gen Z as a population. And a couple of things that popped out. One was that according to Gallup last year, 7 point was actually I have a slide. Of course, I have a slide for everything. It's 7.6% of U.S. adults identify as LGBTQ according to Gallup, in last year. But when you look at some data around Gen Z, it's 28% of Gen Zers identify as queer. And couple with that, about 5 years from now in 2030, Gen Z will make up a third of the workforce. And,
Yeah.
and so here's a third of the workforce where almost a third of them identify as queer. And oh, yeah, by the way, 83% of them say the company I'm going to work for better be focused on DE&I. Like that's what gives me so much hope, because those of us
Hmm.
who've been around a while and have been doing
Hmm.
this fight for
Uh-huh.
several decades, I mean, it's not that we're tired, but we've been doing this for a while.
Hmm.
And these younger folks, this is the world they lived in. They've grown up with DE&I. And
Yeah.
so you can't just take that away from them without hearing from them. And they will be very vocal. So I'm kind of
Yes,
excited. I mean, I'm fearful, of course, and especially
of course.
from several of our especially our trans siblings. But I'm also hopeful because I'm like, you know what? Nothing galvanizes a group more than having a common enemy. And if
Right.
you're going to do this, we're going to fight back because we've done it before.
Right. And we'll do it again. Go back one set of numbers, if you could,
Yeah.
please, back to that 28%, because I
Yeah.
don't want to brush past that.
Yeah.
I want our listeners to hear that number, because the number is important, right? It's 28% of Gen Z adults identify as LGBTQ plus. 28%. We need to listen to that number.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember growing up in my era, if you will, and the number was 10%, 10%,
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was pulled out of the sky. But if you look at 7.6% of US adults identify as LGBTQ, that's a powerful number in and of itself,
Yeah.
because those are the people who feel confident and powerful enough
Correct.
in their being and in
Yeah.
their authenticity to say it. I think that number is super low,
Oh,
super low.
absolutely. Well, and you can even see that like when Gallup first started doing this
Mm-hmm.
research in 2012, 3.5% people identified as LGBTQ plus. Then 8 short years later, it went up to 5.6. Now it's 7.6. And I make the argument, I'm like, I don't think America's getting gayer, although I'd love to make America gay again. But it's because people are getting more comfortable. But you still look at the
Mm-hmm.
data, it's not these studies, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still hovering at about 50% of LGBTQ people are out at work. Still. 50%. And depending on the study, it might go up a little bit or down a little bit, but it's still hovering at about half of folks feel comfortable in the workplace to be their authentic selves. And I think there's an opportunity there. Now, given the new administration, the Equality Act, which is what we truly need to get in place,
Mm-hmm.
is most likely in jeopardy, or
Mm-hmm.
thrown on the back burner for yet another however many years. But I think the tolerance that the American people have in general for, being okay with someone being gay and using the general term, it keeps growing. And acceptance is still there. And we're not going back in the closet anytime soon.
No. And I've always said, I think, when I started this podcast, I wanted several takeaways. And one of the takeaways that I wanted was to leave people with a question mark
Mm,
of what else do I need to know? What else do I need to learn? Because I have said multiple times that those that are most vocal about the trans community have never sat down with a person who's trans or going through the transition, right? They don't
yeah.
know of what they speak. I call it bandwagon jumping. They've heard
Hmm.
someone say something on Facebook or Instagram, they hop on it, take it on as truth, and then go out and spread it. But they've never really spent any time. And after I spent quite a bit of time on this podcast with a man by the name of Archer that I'm just enamored by. I've mentioned
Oh,
him multiple times, Archer Gray, watching him live this authentic life as a member of the community, Steve, it changed my perception. I used to be admittedly very not afraid, that's kind of a strong word, but I was a
mhm.
little unsure of the drag community. I don't
Mm,
know why. I spent a lot of time with some local drag performers here and have fallen in love with all of them. And so it's because of that unknown. It's because of that inability to really relate or spend time to relate. So again, same thing. You mentioned it earlier. A big part of this kind of equality was the cisgendered white gay male.
yep.
And where were the women? Where were the people of
Yeah.
color? Where were the more marginalized communities? And so I started an organization here in San Diego called OutPro. It's a networking
Yeah.
group for
Yep.
LGBTQ
Yeah.
professionals. And when I was approached, they said, we want you to launch this chapter in San Diego. And I said, I won't do it if it's another group where there's a bunch of, no
White gay
offense,
dudes.
cisgendered white guys standing around a bar eating
Totally.
cube cheese and salami, drinking a beer. That's not networking. And so I said, we have to have that diversity. And so we spent 3 or 4 months, reaching out to the communities within that LGBTQIA group and said, you need to come. We're opening the door for you. And I think you'll understand this too. And probably a lot of your conversations stem around where the community will say, we don't have a seat at your table.
Yeah.
And I say, throw the table out, let's build a table together, because it's not about inviting someone to have a seat at our table. It's sit down at the table with us and let's create something great.
Yeah.
What is your what is your most common misconception from people when you are coaching them in this leadership capacity?
I think there's that whole imposter syndrome thing. And and even just starting out with, oh, I do leadership development. One of the first things I'll hear, especially from someone who's newer on their professional journey, is, oh, I'm not a leader. I'm like, shenanigans. Everyone is a leader. And I cite in Pride Leadership, a story that I learned that from my mom. My
Mm.
mom was a career secretary. She was like the only secretary in elementary school. Like, but she ran that school, and everyone looked to her for everything. And a potential teacher would walk in to interview with the principal, and they meet my mom at the desk, and then they go in and meet the principal. They would come out, and the principal would immediately walk out after the person left and say, Joyce, that's my mom's name, or is my mom's name. Joyce, how did they treat you? And because the principal knew that mom ran the school. And so
Mhm.
I tell that in Pride Leadership and actually in a lot of my keynotes and such, because it really gets people thinking about what is leadership, and leadership is influence, and every person out there has influence, whether it be up, side, down, doesn't matter. And I think that's the biggest thing that I hear from so many, especially queer people, who are like, oh, I'm not a leader. Oh, I can't lead that organization. I can't lead my department. I can't lead my employee resource group. I'm like, yes, you can. You already have these skills, and that's why I wrote the 6 competencies in Pride Leadership.
Hmm. When you're either coaching them or you're having them read your book or they're sitting and listening to one of your keynotes, what's the advice that you give them to take that first step?
The first thing is to be open to reflect on how you've gotten here, because chances are, if you look at these 6 competencies: authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture, you've already been playing with these. And that's
Hmm.
kind of what's in Pride Leadership. That's what, and I actually created an online training program that uses Pride Leadership as a textbook. I did it that way on purpose. I always knew I wanted to help educate other queer folks to empower them and their competencies. But I say, if you're just out, you're already exercising leadership courage, maybe just not in the way you thought about it. I guarantee you're empathetic for the plight of any of us other that's out there. You already build culture by just sake of being part of our rainbow family. And so once you start phrasing it that way, and people are like, oh yeah, I have been doing this. Yes. Now let's just amp that up a little bit more and use the skills you've already developed to make you even more effective leader than you already are.
Hmm. I think the authenticity and the courage are the two biggest, right? I think those are the ones that are really hard to overcome. I think people innately will have that empathy. I think we do as a community. We
Yeah.
feel that empathy. Communication can be learned, it can be taught, I think. Even if you're someone who doesn't like to communicate, I think that can be something that is nurtured. And of course, relationships and culture. But that authenticity piece is a really hard piece. From my experience, it's been because we're told our entire lives that we can't be that authentic self. We
Mm,
can't be that truth. I've chatted with a few people I'm sure you know through your work and people who are change makers in our community, but that have said, it took me years to find that authenticity
yeah.
because I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what being gay meant. And so we didn't have the languaging. We
Yeah.
didn't have the experience. I remember growing up, and the only gay person that I knew was Mr. Albert, who cut my mom's hair. And God bless the man, but he was incredibly flamboyant,
Yeah.
wore very tight white jeans all the time. And I didn't relate to that. That wasn't me. I knew that I liked
Yeah.
boys, but I thought, is that what being gay is?
Yeah.
So now it's very different because we have social media and we have television shows and we have all of that external, but there's still a conversation of, can I really truly be that authentic self?
Mm,
And so I wonder if that comes first with that courage component, right?
yeah.
Because that's got to come from somewhere. And do we get pushed to that courage point when we
Mm.
just can't take it anymore, when we can't take that oppression anymore? Does that courage build up to a point where the lid blows off,
Mhm.
if you
Yeah.
will? You know?
It's a great question. And, and I actually argue in Pride Leadership in the Lions leadership program, these are all so intertwined. Like,
Yeah.
you brought courage and authenticity. Absolutely. I can't build relationships without having empathy. I can't communicate effectively and not shape my workplace culture. And so I think that all of these are there, but it's just like any other skill, whether it be you're a musician, an athlete, a singer, whatever. You have to nurture that and you have to grow that. So, like, I'll pick on courage there because you brought it up. I meet some leaders and they automatically have that courage, or you meet some younger folks and they've been out since they were in middle school because they have that courageousness of their authenticity and to share it with the world. It's like, that's fantastic. I've been fortunate enough, once I figured out, and I finally figured out, like I said, I was in my mid 20s when I finally you realize that, oh, that's what my authenticity looks like.
Mhm.
And what's kind of interesting is once I figured that out, now I didn't like walk into my first professional job and said, "Hey, I'm gay. Here I am," But I started going around to like my boss, being like, "Hey, I just wanted to
Right.
let you know something, blah blah blah." But I never went back in the closet once I figured it out. Now that's
Mhm.
not everyone's situation, and that's fine. And I think there's embedded in all this is your comfort level and safety. And so going back to that 50% of why folks maybe aren't out at work, it could be that you're in a workplace culture where you've witnessed somebody else being out and you're like, ooh, they got dinged. They didn't get that promotion or they didn't get that cool
Mhm.
project. And so we get conditioned that way. So we have to be really mindful of the context on those. But yeah, I think the courageousness and authenticity are so And I would probably say that it takes courage to be authentic. So maybe the next version, I might flip those around. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. What was the conversation that was going through your head that first time that you came out to someone at work? What was that like?
So I had been living back up in Philadelphia with my parents right when I figured out, oh, I think I like boys, and I had got my first boyfriend and was sneaking around, and that didn't feel right to me.
Right.
I mean, it was nice, my first boyfriend, who I'm still
Yeah,
best friends
yeah,
with. We're still best friends to this day,
yeah,
like 37
yeah.
years later. But once I left kind of the safety, if you will, of where I grew up and having to closet those things, and I moved back down to Orlando for time number two, but this time very different because I knew who I was. I knew that authentic self. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to feel that way ever again. I don't want to feel that ickiness of, for
Hmm.
me at least, going back into the closet. And so when I took the job that brought me back to Orlando time number two, I was really conscientious to look at the corporate culture and to start, it was just little things and as queer folks, we're all really good about like being little anthropologists and look. It's a safety mechanism, of course. We're looking
Hmm.
for
Sure.
those safe harbors. But I was in during the interview. I'm looking around like at all the folks, and were there people of color at least, and starting to figure out, how inclusive is this workplace? Because this is well before. I mean, this is before Windows existed, to be
Yeah.
honest with you, and there wasn't an internet, so I couldn't go on Indeed.com or Glassdoor or whatever and do my picking around. And so I was just kind of looking around, and that was one of the interview questions I would ask was something. And now in hindsight, it wasn't very veiled, but I thought it was like, how do we embrace different kinds of people at this company, this little
Mm.
software company that I was joining? And the conversation was really good. And so going through my head, I was like, okay, I think I found a safe space. I'm not sure, but let's start with my new boss first and kind of let her know the deal. And
Hmm.
she's like, I don't care. Like she really didn't. And so that was like that positive conditioning. So I'm like, okay, let's go to
Hmm.
the next person
Hmm.
in that private space. And they're like, I don't care, Steve. You're fun and you can do the job really well. I'm like, yeah, okay, cool.
I just want to drive this point home because I think there's a lot of people potentially that are out listening that don't understand the gravity of that first conversation, whether
Mm,
it's coming out at work or coming out at home. I mean, that's something that I think once you open that gate and you let it out, that you start to change. You as an individual start to
yes.
feel freer and you start to feel a lot less intimidated, if you will. And I think there's a process that we go through that blossom into something more, and that people on the outside of our world don't necessarily understand the power and the impact that that has on us. I'm very fortunate. I working in the entertainment industry and then going into events and meetings and I'm surrounded by an incredibly supportive community. I don't remember coming out at work. Coming out to my mom and my family was even harder at the
Yeah.
time. And I was in my 20s. I found the courage at a personal development seminar called the Landmark Forum. I was the first person to stand up in the very first day in the first hour of the class and stand on a chair and scream, I'm gay and I can't hide it anymore. And I don't care who doesn't like it. It changed my world, but it
Yeah,
really changed
sure.
my world because I've known since I was 8. So those 16 years were fraught with so much shame and
Yeah.
guilt and fear. And we can parlay that into our workplace. When we go into those leadership roles or we go into those positions where we want to grow, we want to develop, and we're having those same conversations as we had when we were 7 years old, going, if I tell someone, then I'm going to be judged. But I want people to understand that yes, you have to find your safe space. You have to know that not going to be an issue. But once you start to speak your truth and who you are out into the world, into existence,
Yep.
then that's when life happens, and that's when the opportunities come at you. And then it at some point doesn't even become an issue necessarily. I remember this past week being on a program and I had a conversation and I said something about the current climate within this new administration and the LGBT community. And she said,
Mhm.
why do you care about the LGBTQ community? And I looked at her and I'm like, because I am one,
It's
a
my people.
member of that community. It's my people. And she's like, you're gay? And I'm like, come on, girl. It's like, really? Really? But it made me think about something that
Yeah.
who she had me to be all these years, and I've known her for 16 years,
Oh, wow.
but through a business sense. This is not
Sure, sure,
through,
sure.
and
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not friends with these people on social media
Yeah.
at work. But it was interesting to me that she's held the space for me so long, and it changed the dynamic of our conversation because it allowed me the ability to really go into what it means to be the president CEO of a company at,
Yeah.
58 and having started out and run this business. And yet I don't know that I would have necessarily had a lot of those opportunities
Yeah.
beforehand. And so because I felt so comfortable being myself after coming out at
Mm,
24, and I could see the click and the light switch go on in
yeah.
her head with this conversation because we left both thinking a little bit more deeply about what that means to be authentic and what
Yeah.
that means to be out and proud.
It's funny, Eric. You made me think when earlier in that career, when I was slowly coming out to coworker by coworker, it was maybe not even 6 months later. I was in the men's restroom, and there were two of my colleagues were in there, and they were just talking, and we were all just doing our thing. And the one colleague said to the other one, like a pretty nasty gay joke,
Mhm.
and I was just like, oh my God. And it was like the first time in a workplace situation, now knowing who I was, I had to make that decision. Do I say something or not? And so, you know, I'm washing my hands. He comes over, washes his hands, and I say, "Hey, Bob," or whatever his name was. I said, what you just said is really offensive to. I don't know where I got this courage. Talk about courage, but I'm like, "Bob, what you said was really offensive to me because I'm gay, and that kind of hurt." And he's like, what? Like, and so now that was like the breaking point that I publicly
Mhm.
outed myself. It wasn't the selective piece.
Mhm.
And it's like flash forward to what I do now. And it's funny that my last book that came out just last year called Your Queer Career, it's basically questions I would get from some of my coachees and the people going through my queer leadership program. And so I kind of collected them a la Dear Abby and be like, Dear Gay Leadership Dude, I think my boss is homophobic. What do I do? And so I answered those questions
Mhm.
and put them in the book. And one of the things that I say in the book, because it's a question I actually get quite a bit, and going back to my little young Stevie situation, is if the workplace has a value about embracing differences, embracing inclusivity, and people are violating that, you have the absolute right to use that as a sword and a shield. And I think
Mhm.
when we're talking about having courage, yes, that takes courage to do. But if someone's going against your workplace values, that's a violation of
Mhm.
what the norm is in that particular workplace context. And you can go ahead and use that because you have the backing of everybody in that organization because that's what
Mhm.
you signed up for and how you run your business.
Yeah. And I heard someone say the other day that, they're going to now be so much more cautious and conscientious about companies that they will work for and going to apply for that will retain these DE and I
Mm,
programs. And I think that's going to become an interesting walk to walk over the next couple of years to see how that plays out. And we're seeing that already with some companies saying, you're not taking that from us. We're going to keep it,
yeah.
and we'll see what happens. I believe that that's going to become a very powerful conversation for companies in the future to stand up again
Oh
against
yeah.
what they're being told.
Well, and then going back to that Gen Z data, 83% of them are looking for companies that focus positively on DE&I, and they're going to be a third of the workforce. And so it's like,
Mhm.
y'all better get your house in order because these folks they're going to be a huge talent pool for you. And if you're not on the bandwagon now, I mean, 2030 is not that far away. And
No,
and when's the last time, Eric, you ate a Chick-fil-A? You know?
never.
Yeah, right. Our community remembers who supports us and who doesn't. And so these brands that are totally like pulling back, they're going to shoot themselves in the foot. I think one of the other data points that I absolutely love, and this is actually a free training I created for actually queer folks
Mhm.
about all these different studies I've been reading over the past like 6 months and pulling the threads together to kind of get a better picture than some of the headlines that you're seeing. And one of my favorite data points was the queer community globally has a $4.7 trillion spend purchase power. $4.7 trillion, $1.4 trillion alone in the US. We got some money. I mean, that's a broad statement, but as a collective community, we have a lot of buying power. And so these brands that are pulling back, we will remember. I
Mhm.
don't think I'm going to be going and buying some stuff at John Deere anytime soon or Tractor Supply. And
Mhm.
maybe that I didn't, but you know what? I was a low shopper. And now my husband's
Mhm.
like, where can I shop now? I'm like, hey, here's the app that you can play with.
Right.
And we remember that brand loyalty because those who got our back, they're our allies and we love them. Those who don't, or those who went backwards because they were being performative allies in rainbow washing every June, and then July 1st, taking everything back. We
Yeah.
remember. And data is too easy to find for us to forget that.
Well, and we're now more on alert than we've ever been. I think we're more in tune with being, very conscious of not only what we're saying and who we're supporting, but we just all now to just band together and make sure that we're
Yeah.
supporting those that support
Yeah.
us. And that's a given. That's a given. So another question.
Yeah.
When you're in the process of coaching someone going through the leadership development, ultimately, what's the end goal for the individual? Is it to simply find one of those six competencies that they want to focus on? Is it to get them to be proficient in all? Like, I'm curious as to what that's like because that could take some time.
Yeah, it's a journey, just like I said earlier, anytime you do a leadership competency or really any competency for humans to learn something, you
Mhm.
really have to take effort. And there's this thing I talk about actually in Pride Leadership. It's what we in the learning and development world know. It's how humans learn.
Mhm.
And there's like four classifications. So basically, and I use a running analogy of, how we learn to drive a car. If you take those little toys, you might remember
Mhm.
like for a 2-year-old that looks like a steering wheel and there's a little horn and a gear shift. If you put that in front of a 2-year-old and say, here you go and drive a car, they just play with it, but they don't know what they're doing. And so we say from a learning that skill, it's unconscious incompetence. Unconscious, they're not
Mhm.
aware of the skills, and incompetent, they can't do the skill anyway. But then as you move through life and move through experiences, you start to adjust that. You move to conscious incompetence, meaning like, oh, I now get an idea of what it takes to do that skill, competence, but excuse me, consciousness, but then I
Mhm.
still can't necessarily do it. Like, an 11-year-old probably can't go drive my car, down the highway.
Sure.
But then you have like that 16-year-old who's in driver's ed, is practicing. So they have conscious competence. They can do it, competence, but they have to think about it consciously. And then you have many of us who are listening or watching, where sometimes we get into our car, we turn the ignition, and all of a sudden we're home in our driveway, our garage. Like, how did I get here today? I don't remember. You have
Exactly.
unconscious competence because you unconsciousness, you don't have to think about it, but you can still do it, competence. And the point of my story is, my job is to get people at least to that conscious competence so that they're thinking about what it takes to do those different skills and abilities to be a more effective leader. But some folks, depending on where they come into the mix, might be bumped up to that unconscious competence that they can do some of these skills without really having to think about it.
So is unconscious competence a good thing or a bad thing?
It depends on I think the skill that you're looking for.
Okay.
It usually is a good thing though. It means
Okay.
that you can perform and do the task or do the job, or in this case, lead very well, without having to really think about it and struggle with it. It's just automatic to you.
Mhm. Do you see a difference in cultures that you're working with that may have more struggle in finding that kind of authenticity and courage than others? Is that something that you see within the LGBTQ, plus community?
I'm fortunate enough that I do have a global perspective. A
Hmm.
lot of the employee
Yeah.
resource groups who use our queer leadership program are global in nature. So they're sending their queer leaders from all over the globe through our stuff.
Hmm.
And then there's one-on-one coaching component. So I really get to know the
Hmm.
folks quite well. And I would say it's there is some of that influence within certain parts of the world that maybe have a bit more quote unquote machismo look or whatever. But I think it's more about the individual
Hmm.
and their experience. I mean, I have some amazing graduates of my program who are from the trans community who are just being their authentic self in a country that probably isn't as cool with it, quote unquote.
Hmm.
Not saying our country is cool with it anymore, but there's that. But like that's just so powerful to see. So I think there's a big equation on what that looks like, and the individual's part of it, their cultural context is part of it, the support of the company that they're part of or the
Hmm.
workplace that they're with is also part of it. And so I think these kind of play out a little bit more than where they sit in the world.
Yeah, I remember before I stepped down my post at this organization, I made my team promise to continue to reach out to those outlying communities within
Mm,
San Diego. I remember when we first started, we were seeing again this very cisgendered white gay attendance. Once we started to really reach out to the communities and say, where is the Black community? Where is the Latinic
mm,
community? They're there, they're out there. I've seen them. walking up and down Hillcrest. I know they're
Yeah.
there. The thing that concerns me and is the thing that consistently breaks my heart, Steve, is especially within our Latin community, is that sense of maybe I don't have access to this. I don't have
Yeah.
access to this leadership training. And I remember saying to many people, we've built this foundation and everybody is welcome. Yet there's
Mhm.
that kind of internal dialogue of maybe I'm not good enough or maybe I don't fit in. And my makes me emotional just talking about it. My hope is that we move through the next 4 years that our community,
Mm.
the ones that show up a little more consistently than others, will make a point to reach out to those that
Yeah.
don't. And I worry deeply about the communities that are in the background, if you will,
Hmm.
and what this next 4 years could do to
Yeah.
their strength and their courage. And so I'm hoping that as people listen and we get the word out, that everybody has access to this type of leadership development. Everybody has access to be able to be the best person that they can be and to be the bright shining star, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be from a certain socioeconomic background either. It just means you have to get out there and ask for the help and
Mm.
ask for the support and the education. We live in a town here in San Diego. Obviously, Orlando is very diverse as well. I'm sure it's a lot of
Mm.
transient as well. People come in to work for the theme parks and all of
It's actually
that. And
less,
some
less than you think. Less than you
is
think in
it?
the down.
Is
Yeah,
it?
down to, it's like people either come to Orlando for like a theme park or a conference,
Yeah.
and it's like those are so far away from the downtown community. And so
Yes.
I'm like, have you ever been downtown? They're like, no. I'm like, oh my gosh, we have like a phenomenal food scene here that we're just starting to get known. I mean, it's been here for a while, and
Right.
it's like we're not just theme parks and chain restaurants, friends, but so the downtown area
Right.
is so much less transient. But yeah, as you get toward the parks and stuff, yeah, you do have a facet of the community and as well as the queer community that are coming and going. But Orlando's got
Right.
some old timers
Oh,
here.
yeah, and I was not to discount my Orlando friends because I can already hear them calling me after saying that, and I'm going to be there in 3 months. I didn't,
Right.
I didn't, I didn't mean the community like of itself. I meant the kind of transientness of people coming in to work for the theme parks and then
Yeah.
go. Kind of like the hospitality industry in Hawaii. They get over there and work, and it's a little isolated. They come back to the mainland. So
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
Got it.
More
Got it.
so that kind of transient within the workforce, not necessarily residents. But I think it's something that I, I don't know personally how to yell it any louder and to get out into the
Mm,
community and say, we see you
yeah.
and we acknowledge you and we celebrate you.
Sure.
I use that a lot. Mama Tits from Puerto Vallarta, that little bar that she did that drag show in. And the last thing she said as she walked off stage was surround yourself with people who celebrate you.
Yeah.
And our community does that so well. But I think sometimes we forget that there are some outlying community members
Yeah.
that need that little nudge to reach out to people like you.
And
I'm
and
really, oh, go ahead.
And I was gonna say, and I think one of the things that we need to remember internally to our little rainbow family is that we need to be allies for each other. So
Hmm.
I obviously don't know the trans experience, but I need to be a good trans
Hmm.
advocate and trans ally. Now, what does that mean? That's not being the white cisgendered savior every time. No, it's smart allies know when to stand in front of, when to
Yep.
stand next to, and stand behind the group that they're not necessarily a part of. And I think we can do a little bit better with that. And I do think that the challenging times going forward are going to galvanize us to not take that for granted because we need every single one of us together to support one another, to love one another, and to make
Mhm.
sure that hate doesn't win, love wins.
You have been dropping these amazing bombs throughout this entire conversation. So I want you to say that again because smart allies need
Smart
to know
allies,
when.
smart allies need to know when to stand in front of, next to, or behind the group that they're there to support.
It doesn't always mean that you have to get out there in the front lines and fight the
Yeah.
fight. It sometimes just may mean that you may reach out to one of our brothers and sisters and say, I see you and I support you.
Yep. 100%.
That's all it takes. We feel alone. I love that. Oh gosh. See, I got the goosebumps. You can't see it, just like some people can't see the words behind you, but I get goosebumps on that. Just for a quick minute, if you can, to someone who's listening who really doesn't understand the importance of DE and I.
Mm,
Can you give a little synopsis of why that's important? Because I think it sometimes come across as it's just another thing they have to think about.
just
But
another
why is
HR.
that?
Yeah.
But why is that important?
Yeah, and this is where I get a little frustrated with all the swirl, as we used to say at Disney, that's happening with DE&I. DE&I is meant to make every single employee or person that works in the workplace feel a sense of belonging. That's the end game. So when I have a sense of belonging from a workplace perspective, I'm going to do better work. I'm not going to phone it in. I'm going to give 100%. I'm going to stick around longer. I'm going to produce things. I'm going to be more innovative. And so ultimately it impacts the bottom line. And so what I've learned over the years, as much as I think it's the absolute important thing to do to make the world a better place, I have learned to not approach it from that perspective. I go into businesses, or my team goes into businesses, and we start with the business case. Why is this important? And really there's three different reasons. Because legally you have to do it. Now, obviously that stuff is changing like on a daily basis. On the opposite side, yes, it makes the world better, but in the middle is the business case. And so DE&I isn't just about like the HR flavor of the month. It's not about making people feel bad about who they happen to be. It's about celebrating all the differences that an individual brings to the workplace. And that can be the big ones or the small ones. It could be, my race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability. It could be smaller things like, where did I go to school, or what did I study, or what handedness am I? Those are all different facets of uniqueness or diversity that makes an individual look at the world just a different way. I'm not a human parent in this lifetime, but I'm a canine parent. So I know I look at the world a little bit differently because of my canine kids versus my BFF who has a daughter and is thinking about things from her perspective. And so, smart DE&I programs are there to celebrate the difference and foster that sense of belonging for all individuals, regardless of who they are.
I'm going to put that on a bumper sticker. I th- I am very clear that DE&I has been lumped into the category of the LGBTQ community, and it really isn't. I think it's gotten muddled by this conversation that it is only our community. But
Yeah.
you've mentioned a couple of the groups. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I can quickly, this is a model that
Yeah.
I use in all of our, well, we use in all of our training. It's all the 5 layers of diversity by Garden Schwartz Rowe, two amazing pioneering women in the DE&I space. And so
Mhm.
they kind of tried to make sense of how you define diversity. And so it's, if you're not seeing this, it's kind of five concentric circles that look like a bullseye, if you will. And this represents every single human. And so in the core of what makes every single human human and unique is our personality. There will never be another Eric. There will never be another Steve. Our personality makes us that unique individual. But then the next layer out is what Gard, Schwartz, and Rowe call the internal dimensions. So these are the things that we often go to when we think of DE and I. And they're typically things that don't necessarily change over the course of our life. They are like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability, although that of course can change over your lifetime, gender identity. These are things that are kind of solid and they're there. And unsophisticated organizations just stay here. They just stay in the internal dimensions. Yes, they're super important. I'm not saying they're not, but diversity is a broader conversation. So then we go to external dimensions. And so these
Mm.
are the things that can change quite frequently. And there are income, religion, our personal habits, our physical appearance, what we do as recreation, our parental status, marital status. These are all different and malleable, but they affect how we look at the world and how we interact with it. Like I said, my friend who has a daughter versus me being married versus my single friends. We just look at things differently. And then we do organizational dimensions. So that's like in the context of where you're physically at, what group you're with. So it could be like my work content area. Oh, I'm in marketing, I'm in sales, I'm in, production. It could be the division of departments, my seniority, my physical work location. Oh, I'm in the Orlando office. Oh, Eric, you're in the San Diego office. We do things a little bit differently out here in the California. Okay, I get it. I started adding legacy organization because I do a lot of work with mergers and acquisition companies. And
Mhm.
so you have, oh, you're the former blank company, even though you're now one company. And so you start looking at it from the context of organization. And, I'm in sales, so I look at this situation this way. Oh, no, I'm in production. I look at it that way. And then they have, well, the last one is called country of operation. And so it's really, where you physically sit in
Mm.
the world does impact. So to your question earlier, that's why I said it's part of that equation. So it
Mhm.
might be part of the mix, but it's not necessarily the be all end all. And so it's what political system do you sit in where you're working, the laws, the language, business etiquette is part of that. So all those things kind of come into play way to contribute to your uniqueness as a human being. It's not just race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability. Yes, they're super important, but there's other things too that impact how you look at the world in a unique sort of way.
Wow. Number one. I
You're
love a
getting a
guy who
lesson
can
today.
I love a guy who can pull up a good graphic and walk us through it. Uh, this is the thing though, Steve, and this is where I just sit back and go, wow, if we would teach a class in high school of what you just, maybe it's just a little breakout mini course of what you just talked about.
We have one.
Well, I know you do now, but I'm thinking if we all went through
Yeah.
that class and we all sat through that in high school or even in college, and we talk about why diversity is important. What is diversity? What does it include? You've shattered in just that little 3-minute discussion. You've shattered the argument that everyone's giving about DE and I, that
Yeah.
it becomes about identity and gender and sexuality. And yet we don't look at that.
Mm.
I have a friend who's deaf,
Yeah.
and I have a friend who's in a wheelchair,
Yeah.
and that's diversity, equity, inclusion,
Yeah,
all of those
absolutely.
things. And yet we're out here talking about the gay community and all of
Mm.
that nonsense. So I really, one day, I hope that what you just talked about is taught in school because it would have us, walk out into the world knowing that the world's a little different and a little diverse than what we may feel. That's an interesting question that I was curious as you were talking about that. I don't want to get slack from my fellow citizens, but is this a bigger confusion for us Americans as it is globally, since you do global work? Or are other countries just going, yeah, this is great? Or are we,
No, no,
no?
it's still a big question all over the world. And quite frankly, most people do go to that internal dimensions and stay there.
Mhm.
That's from my experience, that's kind of the common mistake that's done. And there might be some nuances from a little bit of the external dimension, especially when we talk about religion as being part of
Mhm.
that or things. But no, it's sadly it's a human flaw that we think about it just through this tiny little lens when we should be
Mhm.
thinking about it from a broader lens. Like I didn't even put in here handedness because and I think about my left-handed friends as kids who had those really horrible they wouldn't give them a left-handed desk where there was like one in the room and you had the kids who are craning you're trying to write. I mean, like that's not fun. But those
Mhm.
kids were looking at the world a little bit differently just because of the hand that they preferred to use, that it was more
Mhm.
dominant. And
Mhm.
and so, like I said, these are big or small ways, excuse me, that contribute to our world. But yeah, I think globally we all have an opportunity. At Disney, we always said an area of opportunity. It was never a problem. Area of opportunity to think about how we look and approach inclusivity in a different way. And I think because we're getting into the bias on phrasing of words, DE and I, inclusiveness, I'm all about belonging because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
that's your goal. If
Mhm.
somebody who is just different than you feels that they belong in whatever space you've created, then you're done. You've done it.
Mhm.
And I think that's where changing the conversation and actually the migration of the DE and I quote unquote profession, getting rid of that word because it's tainted and moving more toward
Yep.
belonging. We were doing that
Belonging.
before.
Mhm.
That's the better route anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that. I get this little PTSD cringe. I was in second grade and I was teased relentlessly because I was colorblind and we didn't know
Oh,
it.
yeah.
And so I literally
Yeah.
looked at the world through a different color lens. But what was interesting was my mom went out and bought me pens with the names of the color on it so that I knew that if a
Aw, good
tree
mom.
was green and the grass was green and the flowers were yellow, that I could go find those colors and to teach myself as opposed to being afraid to color, if you will.
Mm,
But I didn't know any other kids that were colorblind. I felt very alone in that. Had I known that there were
mm.
other kids like that, there was that inclusion. So it goes so much deeper and so much broader than any of us, I think, even want to wrap our head around. And so I'm grateful that there are people out in the world like you that are taking the time and making an effort to have people think a little bit differently about DE and I or belonging. I love
Belonging.
that word, belonging. I think that that's great that there are people who are out teaching belonging because it's so important. I think there is so much hidden talent out in the world. There are so many amazing leaders that are out there that are afraid to maybe step up and be leaders. So thank you for doing that work. I know that I could sit and talk to you forever. I hope you will come back again and let's have another conversation. I'm going to ask you two final questions and then we'll wrap this up. Where do you see the gay leadership dude going over the next 5 years? What's next for you?
Oh, it's hard to say given the context of what's happening. I think one of two things, quite personally, is going to happen with especially my business. It's either going to, after 17 years, fold because people are too afraid, or I'm going to hopefully have way more work than I know what to do with because organizations are going to try to counterbalance some of the narrative that's out there. And from what I've seen, from what my gut tells me, and I have a pretty darn good gut, I think it's going to be the latter. I think organizations are going to say, you know what? No, we know the importance, i.e., the data I shared earlier, and how important that is. And we're gonna double down. So we're gonna hire folks like Steve and Top Dog Learning Group to come in and really help our folks since they can't do it elsewhere. So I think that's going to be part of it. I'm about to embark on, between promoting Your Career, the latest book, as well as Pride Leadership came out in 2019, no pun intended, but it needs a refresh. And so my publisher and I have been talking about that. It's been more than 5 years. The world's very different than 2019. And so, we're kind of working on that version 2.0 of that. The podcast that we had, Your Career, we put on hold last year. So probably dusting that off a little bit and just trying to make a world a bit more inclusive, one queer and ally leader at a time.
It's fantastic. We're going to go ahead and put the links to your work and to your books and to your leadership group and the Gay Leadership Dude in our social media. I'm going to encourage people to go check it out. I've really loved listening to a lot of the videos and reading a lot of the content. I'm hooked. You also offer an ongoing online class, I believe, if I remember correctly.
We created a space for queer and ally leaders to meet once a month just to kind of learn a leadership tip or two, like kind of like the 5 layers of diversity. That was one of the modules, and just really to network with other queer and ally leaders. And it's becoming a bit more of almost a wonderful therapy session for some folks, because especially people who are maybe not in an organization that has a lot of LGBTQ plus folks. So it's been really, really rewarding. And and it's completely free. It's just creating that space for an hour on Zoom.
I love it. I'm going to be at the next one. So last question, Steve, if you could go back to that little Stevie, what would you tell him about his life today?
Wear sunscreen, first of all. I mean, I'm in my 50s. I got to keep it looking good. But I think I'm happy of the journey that took me to make me the human I am right now, but I am a little envious of those who figure out their authentic selves a little bit sooner in their journey than I did. So I would say, embrace who you are when you can and when you feel comfortable and safe to do that. But, I still had a good time figuring it out, but a little bit sooner might have been nice.
Well, you look like you're 30, so we're just going to leave it there.
It's a
good lens, good lighting, good lens, good lighting. It's great. Listen, I truly believe this. The world is a better place with you in it, Steve, and for being out, being a stand for the community and our allies. I want to thank you for being here and spending some time with us today and giving us a little glimpse into your leadership world. And again, I hope you'll come back and join us. But thanks for being here today and spending some time with us.
And thank you for creating this space, Eric. All these spaces are important for all of us. So thank you.
You're welcome. Get that podcast back up and running. We need them. All right. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Take care now. All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on today's episode. I hope our conversation resonated with you like it did me, and I cannot wait to sit down with you all again next week. Remember to subscribe to the Just Do You podcast on your favorite platform so you can make sure not to miss a new episode, which drop every Thursday. If you like what you hear, you can easily share the podcast and episode directly with your friends. And if you would, rate us and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. You can also follow us on Instagram at Just Do You Pod. As you go out into the world today, remember to just do you. All right, talk next week.